The wind had a voice in the high valleys of Montana. It was late in the 1880s, and winter had come down from the north like a wolf, settling its white pelt over everything. The snow was deep, burying the sagebrush and piling in drifts against the lee side of the canyons. It choked the passes. The only way in or out of the small settlement huddled by the frozen creek was a single trail, packed hard by necessity and rumor. This trail led to the trading post of Silas Dobbins, a long, low building of log and sod that smelled of kerosene, salted hides, and stale tobacco. When the stagecoach, its runners grating on the ice, finally arrived with the mail, the post became something else. It became a marketplace. The town, such as it was, lived on cattle, trapping, and trade. People accepted things as they were. They accepted the bitter cold, the long nights, and the arrangements made by mail, the arrival of women on the stage. Contracted for marriage was just another transaction, like trading beaver pelts for flour. It was a hard country, and it bred a hard acceptance of facts. Elias Wren came down from the high ridges on the mail day, but not for the mail. He came for salt, lamp oil, and cartridges. His cabin was 2 days' climb above the valley floor, tucked into a fold of granite near a spring that never quite froze. He was a man in his early 30s, built of quiet discipline and survival. The mountains had taken his wife 3 years prior, leaving him with a son, Micah, who was now 6 years old. Elias wanted only to provide for the boy, to keep the cabin warm and the pantry full. He wanted peace. The noise and smell of the settlement were things to be endured, not enjoyed. He tied his horse, a stoic gray gelding, to the hitching rail, the cold biting at his exposed skin. The air was sharp with pine smoke. He pulled his hat low and went inside, his focus already on the list tucked in his memory. Inside, the post was thick with heat and the steam of wet wool. Men crowded the counter, their voices loud and rough. Silas Dobbins was behind the plank bar, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He was the hub of the town, dealing in goods and, when the stage arrived, in lives. He thrived on the small controls, the turning of a phrase that could lift one man and diminish another. He was, in all ways, a merchant. Elias saw them then, huddled by the cold stove at the back of the store. 4 women, their faces pinched with cold and fear. They were the new arrivals, and then he saw the 5th. She stood apart from the others, near the sacks of feed. Her name was Mara Lorne, though no one here knew it. She was in her 20s, an orphan whose uncle had found her presence a burden and her name a commodity. He had entered her into a bridal catalog, but a photograph had been sent, and it had been refused. So the uncle, in an act of petty spite, had ensured she would be delivered without a face. She wore a rough burlap sack over her head, tied at the neck with twine. It was a feed sack, and the printed letters for oats were still visible, facing backward. She had been wearing it since she left the stage, a public mark of her rejection. She could hear the men laughing, hear the wet sound of tobacco hitting the spittoon. She knew Silas Dobbins was enjoying this. He had called her damaged goods. Mara Lorne was not damaged. She knew how to bake bread that would rise in high altitude. She could set a neat stitch in canvas or wool. Her memory was sharp. She could recall the pages of the few books she had read, word for word. But this slow, grinding humiliation had worn away at her, leaving only a core of dignity she held onto with white-knuckled silence. She held her hands clasped in front of her, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. All she wanted was to not be an object of scorn. She wanted to be seen as a person. Elias collected his goods: salt, oil, a small tin of peaches for Micah. He stacked them on the counter, his back to the spectacle Dobbins was preparing. He did not want any part of this. He had his boy. He had his cabin. That was enough. The hole left by his wife was a cold, clean place he did not intend to fill. Filling it meant risking another loss. and Elias Wren was a man who hedged his bets against sorrow. Dobbins saw Elias and grinned, wiping his hands on an apron that was already stiff with grease. "Just supplies today. Wren, or maybe something to warm the cabin, got a fresh shipment." Elias did not look up from his counting. "Just the supplies. Dobbins." "Suit yourself," Dobbins said, his voice rising for the benefit of the room. "But the stock is moving fast." The men in the room turned their attention to the women. Dobbins started his pitch, describing the women like he would a horse, noting their health, their potential for hard work. It was a crude, hollow performance. Mara stood still, breathing the dusty smell of the burlap. She could feel the eyes of the men on her. Even through the rough weave, they were not looking at her, but at the sack. It was a joke. She was the punchline. Elias wanted to leave. He wanted the clean, cold air of the mountain. He wanted the scent of pine and the silence of the snow. He felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar loneliness that he usually ignored. He thought of his cabin, the small fire in the hearth. He thought of the blue lupine he had seen pushing up through a patch of melted snow near the creek, a stubborn speck of life. He thought of the half-frozen stream, its sound a promise of the thaw to come. These were the small, warm currents in his life. He paid for his goods, his movements economical. He packed the salt and cartridges into his saddlebag, keeping the tin of peaches in his pocket. He was almost out the door when he heard a new burst of laughter. Silas Dobbins had moved to the end of the line. He gestured toward Mara. "And this one, the last of the lot, comes with her own mystery." The men laughed again. Elias paused, his hand on the rough wood of the doorframe. He did not turn around. He heard Dobbins continue, his voice slick with false pity. "Afraid this one is sold as is. Photograph got sent back. They say she is not much to look at, but I am told she can cook and clean. A strong back, if nothing else." This was the way of the town. It wanted to file everyone down, to put them in a cheap, easily understood box. Elias was the strange mountain man. She was the girl in the sack. He knew this logic. It was as cold and binding as the ice on the creek. He also heard, underneath the noise, a profound silence. The woman was not weeping. She was not pleading. She was simply standing, her straight back a quiet defiance. He thought of Micah. The boy was too quiet. He spent too much time alone while Elias checked the trap lines. He needed more than salt and canned peaches. He needed a softness Elias could not provide. Elias had told himself it was enough. Just the two of them. He had lied. From the corner of the room, another man watched. Mason Pike, a large landowner from the lower valley. Pike was a patient man, a man who collected debts and deeds. He was buying up land, piece by piece, and his gaze often drifted toward the high country, toward the springs. The cabin of Elias sat squarely on the path of his ambition, blocking a vital grazing route for the spring melt. Pike watched Elias pause at the door, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. He saw every man as a tool or an obstacle. Elias Wren turned around. His movement was slow, deliberate. The room quieted slightly. The mountain man rarely spoke and never involved himself in the town's affairs. He looked past Dobbins, past the leering faces of the other men. He looked at the burlap sack and the small, work-worn hands clasped at the woman's waist. He saw the way she held herself, an anchor of stillness in a sea of mockery. He wanted peace. He wanted to be left alone, but he also wanted fiercely for his son to grow up in a world where people were not treated like feed sacks. His own desire for solitude was at war with a deeper, older instinct. Mara felt the shift in the room. The laughter had died. There was a new tension, a new focus. She could feel a single gaze, steady and heavy, different from the others. It was not mocking. It was measuring. She forced herself to remain still, to not betray the sudden, terrified hope that shot through her. The fire in the stove crackled, eating at the dry pine. The wind moaned outside. a reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness waiting. The slow, heavy tick of the clock on the wall measured out the silence. Elias looked at the woman, then at Silas Dobbins. He had come for salt. He had come for oil. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. Silas Dobbins saw Elias Wren turn. The merchant's eyes, which had been alight with cruel amusement, narrowed in calculation. The room, which had been loud with rough laughter, fell into a watchful quiet. Even the men who had been haggling over the price of the other women turned to look. The mountain man, who wanted nothing to do with any of them, had stopped. "Well, Wren," Silas said, spreading his hands. "Thinking of expanding your household, I have 4 fine prospects." He gestured to the other women, who looked down at the floor, their hope and fear a palpable thing in the stuffy air. Elias did not look at them. His gaze remained fixed on the 5th woman, the one in the feed sack. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her back was held as straight as a lodgepole pine. She did not tremble. She did not sway. She just stood, a pillar of silent endurance. He had come only for salt. He had his son. He did not need this complication. But the sight of her, standing there in her enforced anonymity, struck a chord deep inside him, a cold anger that tasted like iron. Silas followed his gaze and laughed. A short, barking sound. "Oh, that one." He walked over and stood beside Mara, close enough that she could smell the sour tobacco on his breath. She fought the urge to recoil. "This is the last of the lot, boys," Silas announced to the room, "and she comes with a warning. The photograph was, shall we say, not well received." A few men chuckled. "So, she is sold as is, no returns." He tapped the burlap, and Mara flinched, the first involuntary movement she had made. "No need to open the bag. She is not pretty. She is for work. But I am assured." He leaned in, reading from a smudged piece of paper in his hand. "That she can cook, clean, and sew. A strong back, that is all a man really needs. Is it not?" The room erupted in laughter, coarse and wet. Mara's hands, hidden in the folds of her thin skirt, clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. The burlap was hot and scratched her face. She tasted the dust of it. She felt the heat of her own shame. A flush she was grateful they could not see. She held her breath, counted to 5, and let it out slowly, forcing her spine to remain rigid. She would not fall. She would not give them the sound of her weeping. Elias watched the exchange. He saw the flinch. He saw the spine straighten again. He saw the small, calloused hands clench at her sides. He had seen a coyote, its leg caught in one of his traps. Show less courage. He thought of his quiet cabin, of the long winter nights. He thought of his son, Micah, whose laughter was becoming too rare. The boy needed a woman's hand, a softness Elias had lost and could not replicate. He was tired of the silence, but he was terrified of breaking it, terrified of letting someone in only to have the mountain, or sickness, or fate take them again. Yet, he could not turn and walk away. To leave her here was to condone this, to become one of them. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, cutting through the stale air. "Dobbins!" Silas turned, surprised. "Wren." "What happens to her?" Elias asked, his voice flat. "If no one pays—" Silas shrugged, enjoying the attention. "Oh, she will earn her keep. I am not a cruel man. She can scrub the floors here, do laundry for the trappers. A woman can always find work." His tone made the word work sound like a sentence. "Or, if her uncle pays the return passage, I will send her back east. Either way, she is no concern of yours." Elias looked at Mara, then at the floor. He saw the toes of her worn boots, the thinness of her coat. He thought of the journey back east, alone, rejected again. He thought of her scrubbing floors in this post, enduring the hands and jokes of these men. He stepped forward. The men parted for him, their mockery fading into curiosity. He walked to the counter, past Mara. He did not look at her. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and loosened the drawstring. He was a man who lived on trade, but he kept silver for emergencies. This, he decided, was an emergency. He looked directly at Silas Dobbins. "How much?" It was not a question. It was a demand. The room was utterly silent now, save for the crackle of the stove. Silas Dobbins stared. Even Mason Pike, the landowner, leaned forward slightly, his calculating gaze moving from Elias to the woman. This was an unexpected turn. Silas recovered, his merchant instincts taking over. For that one, he tried to sound casual. "She has used goods, you might say. Rejected. I paid her passage. Say $20, silver." It was an insult, the price of a decent saddle. Elias did not barter. He reached into the pouch and began placing silver dollars on the rough plank counter. The sound of the metal, solid and final, echoed in the room. He counted them out, one by one, his movements deliberate. He stopped at 20. Mara heard the sound. 20 coins, the sound of her own worth. She did not know whether to feel relief or a deeper dread. She was being moved from one owner to another, like a sack of oats. She held fast to her goal: a roof, a fire, a place to work without scorn. This man, at least, was not laughing. Elias pushed the stack of silver toward Silas. Silas's eyes were wide. He greedily scooped the coins into his hand, weighing them. A grin split his face. "Well, it seems the mountain man was in the market for a wife after all." He laughed. "Alone this time. She is yours. Wren, take the goods, and good luck to you." Dignity, weighed and sold. Elias felt a sour taste in his mouth. He had done the thing. He had tied himself to another person. The fear of it warred with a strange, grim satisfaction. He turned to Mara. She had not moved. He walked toward her, and she could hear the heavy, even tread of his boots. She braced herself, expecting him to grab her arm, to pull the sack from her head. He stopped 3 feet away. The space he left her was a small, unspoken courtesy. He did not touch her. He did not try to see her face. "The trail is steep," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Can you ride?" She was so startled by the simple, practical question that it took her a moment to answer. Her throat was dry. "Yes," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Good." He nodded once. "Get your things." Mara looked down at her hands. "I have nothing?" Elias looked at her thin coat, at the worn boots. He nodded again. "My horse is outside." He turned and walked to the door. He did not look back, trusting she would follow. For a full second, Mara was frozen. Then she took a breath and moved. She walked past the stove, past the staring, silent men, past Silas Dobbins, who was already counting his money again. She followed the broad back of the stranger who had bought her, and stepped out of the trading post. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was no longer still. The wind had risen, shrieking down from the high peaks, driving pellets of ice that stung her face through the burlap. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, heavy with a coming storm. Elias was already at his gelding, packing the salt and oil into his saddlebags. He worked with an efficient economy of motion. He finished and turned to her. He seemed to assess her thinness against the rising blizzard. "You will ride?" he said. It was an order, but not an unkind one. "I will lead. The trail is iced." He put his gloved hand on the saddle to steady the horse, waiting for her to mount. It was awkward. She could not see well, and the sack hampered her movement. She fumbled for the stirrup. Without a word, he cupped his hand, a firm, impersonal platform. She put her boot into his hand, and he lifted her easily into the saddle. She gripped the cold pommel, her knuckles turning white. He did not give her the reins. He took them himself, wrapped a scarf over the lower half of his face, and began to walk, leading the horse into the teeth of the storm. The journey was a long torment. Mara was blind, seeing only the shifting gray light through the weave of the bag. She could only feel. She felt the plunging gait of the horse as it climbed, the sting of the ice on her hands, the wind that tried to peel her from the saddle. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, invasive ache that made her teeth chatter. Elias did not stop. He was a creature of the mountain, and this storm was just another obstacle. He leaned into the wind, his head down, reading the almost invisible trail. He knew every rock, every treacherous patch of ice. He shielded the horse with his own body when the gusts were at their worst. Mara lost all track of time. She drifted in a haze of cold and misery, clinging to the saddle as her only point of stability in a howling chaos. She must have been weeping, because she felt the burlap freeze stiff against her cheeks. Just when she thought she could not hold on a moment longer, that she would simply let go and fall into the white oblivion. The horse stopped. The wind was somehow louder here, a high, thin scream. She heard Elias's voice raised over the gale. "We are here! Hold on!" He was beside her. His hands, strong and sure, circled her waist and lifted her down. Her legs, numb and frozen, buckled beneath her. She would have fallen, but he held her, steadying her for a moment. He was warm, a solid presence in the storm. Then he let her go and pushed open a heavy wooden door. He nudged her forward. "Inside." She stumbled across the threshold. The wind was cut off as he pushed the door shut behind her, the heavy bar thudding into place. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the howling of the storm outside, now muffled, and the ragged sound of her own breathing inside the sack. It was dark, but it was warm, a deep, radiant warmth. She saw the red glow of embers in a massive stone hearth. Elias moved past her, his form a shadow against the glow. He knelt, stirred the embers, and added dry kindling. A small flame licked up. He added a larger piece of wood. The fire caught, and yellow light flooded the small, one-room cabin. It was built of thick, chinked logs. The smell of pine resin and wood smoke was heavy in the air. A large bed frame, covered in thick furs, took up one corner. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center. Shelves on the wall held tins, tools, and a few books. It was clean, orderly, and profoundly empty. Mara stood by the door, dripping snow onto the floorboards. She did not dare move. She was still wearing the sack. She waited for a command. Elias turned from the fire, his face illuminated by the flames, harsh and shadowed. He looked at her, standing there, a small, burlap-shrouded figure. And then, in the corner of the room, almost lost in the shadows, Mara saw it. A wooden cradle. It was dark, well-used wood, polished smooth by time. It sat beside the hearth, positioned to catch the warmth. It was empty. As she watched, a draft from the still-cold floorboards made it rock, just slightly, back and forth. A silent, ghostly motion. The question screamed in Mara's mind, colder than the wind outside. Whose cradle was this? Where was the child? And the mother? Where was the mother? Elias's gaze followed hers. He looked at the cradle, and his face, which had been merely stern, hardened into a mask of old, deep pain. The heavy bar thudded into place, sealing the cabin against the storm. The wind scream dropped to a muffled, distant howl. In the sudden quiet, Mara Lorne stood dripping by the door, her breath fogging the inside of the burlap sack. The only sounds were the crackle of the new fire and the faint, rhythmic creak of the empty cradle as the draft stirred it. Elias Wren saw where her hidden gaze had fallen. He looked at the cradle, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. That piece of wood held a silence deeper than the snow. He forced his eyes away from it, back to the woman. She was a small, sodden figure, a marker of his own impulsive, uncharacteristic act. She stood as if rooted to the floorboards, awaiting a command. The sack was an offense. He had paid to remove her from mockery. Yet here was the instrument of it, in his own home. He cleared his throat. The sound was abrasive in the warm room. He spoke, his voice low, more accustomed to the vast quiet of the ridges than to indoor spaces. "You can take that off." Mara did not move. She was not sure she had heard him correctly. The wind, or the fear, was playing tricks with her ears. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, edged with an awkward patience. "If you want to." The words were a profound shock. "If you want to, the choice." It was a small, heavy object, placed directly in her hands, her fingers, frozen and numb inside her thin gloves, fumbled at her neck. The twine was wet, the knot drawn tight and hard as ice. She pulled her gloves off with her teeth, her hands clumsy. She could feel him watching, but the gaze was not the pressing, dissecting stare of the men at the post. It was steady. It was patient. He was waiting. Her fingers tore at the knot, her nails scraping skin. The coarse fibers bit into her. Then the knot gave. The twine loosened. She held the bag in place for one last, terrified second. This was her shield. It was her deformity. It was her identity for weeks. To remove it was to be naked, to be judged again. She took a sharp, dusty breath and pulled the sack up over her head. The burlap fell from her hands. It landed on the wet floor with a soft, final thud. There was no laughter. There was no gasp. There was no sound at all, save for the wind pushing against the logs. The sudden rush of clean, warm air on her face made her dizzy. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the firelight. Elias Wren froze. He had braced himself. He had expected what Silas Dobbins had promised, a face to justify the sack, a reason for the cruel rejection. He had expected bitterness, or a cowering fear, or a hollow, vacant stare. He had not expected this. Her face was thin, pale with cold and exhaustion. There were sharp, fine bones beneath the skin. A raw, red chafe marked her neck where the twine had rested. Her hair, a dark, simple brown, was flattened with melted snow and stuck to her cheeks. She was smudged with dirt from the journey, but it was her eyes that held him. They were gray, the color of the sky just before the snow comes, and they were looking directly at him. They were tired. They were deeply, profoundly tired, but they were not broken. They were not ashamed. In her face, Elias saw not the damaged goods he had been sold, but a stubborn, quiet dignity that had refused to be extinguished. It was the same relentless life he saw in the wild lupine that pushed its blue head through the frozen earth by the spring. He was frozen, not by ugliness, as he had been warned, but by a sudden, sharp recognition of her spirit. He realized he was staring, and that his staring was a new kind of prison for her. He looked away, turning his attention to the fire, poking it with a stick of iron. He gave her the moment to breathe the free air. He felt a profound clumsiness. He was a man who understood the language of weather, the heft of an axe, the precise mechanics of a trap. He did not know what to say to this woman, who looked at him as an equal after being traded for silver. He would not compliment her. That would be just another way of putting a price on her. He would not make a demand. He had bought her, he realized, not to own her, but to stop her from being owned. He would give her what he himself understood best: purpose. He gestured to the iron pot hanging on the hearth crane. His voice, when it came, was practical, almost flat. "Can you cook?" It was not a question about her past or her face. It was a question about the evening meal. For Mara, the simple words were a reprieve. She almost smiled, a small, stiff movement of muscles unused to the expression. It was the most beautiful thing he could have said. It was a task. It was normal. She nodded. her throat tight. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Yes." She moved away from the door, her limbs aching and stiff. She unbuttoned her thin, damp coat and hung it on a peg near the hearth. He did not watch her. He was already at the shelves, pulling down supplies, his movements economical. He placed them on the solid table in the center of the room. A sack of onions, a few withered carrots from the root cellar, a joint of smoked rabbit, flour, salt. He had given her the kitchen. This was a language she understood. She went to the water basin, poured fresh water from a bucket, and scrubbed her hands and face. The water was ice cold, and it stung, but it felt good. It washed away the journey. She tied her damp hair back with a stray bit of leather thong she found on the floor. Then she set to work. She found a knife, its blade worn thin but sharp. She began to chop the onions, her movements hesitant at first, then growing sure. The steady thump of the knife on the cutting board was a comforting rhythm. She cut the rabbit into pieces, the carrots into rounds. She added them to the pot with water. She found dried herbs hanging from a rafter, tied in small bunches. She crushed them in her palm, and the cabin air, already heavy with pine smoke, began to fill with the scent of thyme and sage. It was the smell of a home. As she stirred the stew, she let out the breath she felt she had been holding since she left the East. She said a small, desperate prayer in the silence of her own mind. Just let me work. Let me earn this warmth and this food. Let me not be despised. She no longer prayed for kindness or for freedom. She only prayed for a place. They did not speak. The silence grew, settling between them like a thick wool blanket. It was not the empty, aching silence Elias knew from his solitary nights. It was not the hostile, judging silence Mara had endured at the trading post. It was a shared silence, occupied by the chop of the knife, the bubble of the stew, and the steady hiss of the storm outside. Elias sat at the table, a piece of oilcloth spread out, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The metallic click and slide of the oiled bolt was a quiet, steady sound. He watched her, not her face, but her hands. He saw the efficiency in her movements. She found tin plates, spoons. She moved around the small kitchen space as if she had been doing it for years. Her motions economical, wasting nothing. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice quiet, directed at the fire. He had seen her glance at the cradle, and her careful avoidance of it. "My son, his name is Micah. He is 6. Mara paused, the ladle in her hand. She looked at the cradle. It was too small for a 6-year-old boy. The question hung in the air. Elias did not look at her. He continued to stare into the flames. "He is not here. He is in the town. He took a fever last week. I left him with Mistress Cray. She is a widow. She knows remedies. I thought he would be safer there, while I was on the trap lines." His voice was flat, but Mara could hear the deep, cold anxiety underneath it. The shadow of a motherless family, of a past loss, filled the room. The empty cradle was not for Micah. It was a monument. It was the ghost in the cabin. Mara nodded, her throat tight. She understood sickness. She understood loss. She said nothing. She simply turned back to the fire. The stew was ready. It was a simple meal, rabbit and roots, but it was hot, and it smelled of life. She ladled it into 2 tin plates. She put one on the table in front of him. They both looked at the steaming food. Elias bowed his head for a brief, silent moment. Mara did the same. Then they picked up their spoons and ate. The stew was hot, and it pushed the last of the invasive cold from her bones. It was the best meal she had ever tasted. Outside, the blizzard raged, piling snow against the door, cutting the cabin off from the world. But back in the valley, the storm was just beginning. The news had left the trading post before Elias and Mara had even cleared the first ridge. It flew from the post to the saloon, carried on gusts of laughter and disbelief. The mountain man, the silent widower. Elias Wren. He had come down for salt and left with the burlap bride. Silas Dobbins, counting his silver, told the story to every man who came in. He paid $20, did not even ask to see her face, just paid and took her. The story spread. It became a town legend in the space of an hour. Mason Pike, the landowner, heard it as he sat by the saloon stove. A small, cold smile touched his lips. He had been wondering how to get Elias Wren off that mountain spring. A man alone was difficult, predictable, but a man with a new, strange wife, a man with a scandal that was a man with a weakness. The rumor settled over the town, a poison seeping into the snow, waiting for the thaw. In the cabin, they knew nothing of it. The meal was finished. Elias took the empty plates. He gestured to the large bed, the one covered in thick furs. "You will sleep there. It is the warm place." Mara looked at him, her gray eyes wide. She had been dreading this moment. "And you?" He pointed to the floor by the hearth. "I will take the floor. It is my habit." She did not argue. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. He laid out a thick bedroll for himself, his back to her, exhausted down to her bones. Mara climbed under the heavy furs. They were heavy, and they smelled faintly of dried herbs and cold, clean air. She lay on her back, staring up at the dark rafters, listening to the storm. She was in a stranger's cabin. She had been bought like livestock, but she was warm. She was not wearing a sack, and the man on the floor had asked her if she could cook. She listened to the sound of him settling into the bedroll, the rustle of canvas. She listened to the wind, a high, lonely voice in the chimney. For the first time in months, Mara Lorne felt a small, hard knot of fear inside her begin to dissolve. They were two people, sharing a silence in the middle of a storm. And in the high, lonely mountains, that was the beginning of healing. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. It was a white, howling world, a prison of wind and driving snow. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm was born, quiet and hesitant. The small space, which had been the sole domain of a grieving man, now held 2, and then 3. On the first morning, Mara woke early, the furs heavy and warm over her. Elias was already gone, his bedroll neatly tied and stowed. A fresh stack of wood sat by the hearth, and the fire was built up. A solid heart of warmth against the storm. A tin mug of water sat on the stones, just warm enough to drink. It was a silent provision, an unspoken contract. She found the flour bin, the small tin of yeast. She was a woman who understood the language of work. This cabin was a testament to a man's self-sufficiency. Everything had its place. The tools were clean, the shelves orderly. But it lacked a certain kind of tending. It was a shelter, not yet a home. She mixed the dough, her hands still stiff with cold, working the flour and water and yeast. The simple and repetitive motion was a comfort. It was a prayer she knew by heart. She set the bowl near the fire to rise, covering it with a clean cloth. The promise of bread was the promise of life. She swept the floor, her movements careful, not wanting to disturb his order. As she dusted the shelves, she found a small, worn book. It was not a Bible. It looked like a collection of poems, its cover soft with use, tucked inside. She found a single, pressed flower. It was a blue lupine. Its color faded to a pale, papery purple. On the inside cover, a name was written in faded ink. Annalise. Mara's fingers traced the flower. This was the ghost, the mother of the empty cradle. She felt a sharp, sudden pang, not of jealousy, but of a shared, womanly sorrow. She closed the book gently, placing it exactly as she had found it. This was a grief she had no right to touch. She turned back to the hearth, her respect for his unspoken pain deepening. Elias returned in the afternoon. Snow caked on his shoulders, a brace of rabbits in his hand. He moved with the silence of the mountain itself. He stopped just inside the door. The cabin was warm. The floor was swept, and the air was thick with a scent he had not smelled in 3 years. It was the smell of baking bread. It filled the rafters. It seeped into the chinking between the logs. It was a smell of such profound comfort that it stopped him in his tracks. He had provided the flour. She had provided the magic. Mara did not look up, sensing his presence. "The stew is hot," she said, her voice quiet. They ate at the table, the wind screaming outside. The bread was dense and hot, with a hard, perfect crust. Elias ate slowly, his gaze distant. He had bought a woman he did not want, a bride no one had desired. He had expected to see ugliness or shame when the sack came off. He had not expected the stubborn dignity in her tired, gray eyes. He had frozen when he saw her face, not because it was what Dobbins had promised, but because it was not. It was a human face, looking at him as if he were also human. And in that moment, he had seen the trap he had laid for himself. He had bought a person, not a set of hands, and he did not know what to do with her. He finished his bread. He looked at her, sitting across from him, her gaze on her plate. "Up here," he said, his voice rough. "We do not fight the mountain. You cannot win. You learn to live with it. You learn its ways. You see where the snowdrifts will pile, and you build your door on the other side. You see where the wind scours the ridge, and you do not walk there." Mara looked up, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She did not understand. He gestured toward the window, now a solid white square of ice. "This storm, it is not an enemy. It is just what is. We wait, we keep the fire, we eat, we learn to live with it." She nodded slowly. He was telling her something important. He was telling her about himself, and maybe he was telling her about her own arrival. She was a storm he had not expected. He was learning to live with her. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the world was a new, blinding white. The silence was as vast and clean as a fresh sheet. "I will go for Micah," Elias said, pulling on his heavy coat. "The fever should be broken." Mara felt a knot of anxiety. The boy, the sun. She was the intruder. What would the boy see when he looked at her? She was alone in the cabin for most of the day. The quiet was huge. She heard the drip of melting snow, the skitter of a bird on the roof. Late in the afternoon, 2 men on horseback rode up the trail. They were not from the town's center. They were rough, wearing the brand of Mason Pike's Ranch on their saddlebags. They did not dismount. They sat their horses by the stream, looking at the water, then at the cabin, then back at the water. They were measuring. One of them saw her standing in the doorway. He grinned, showing broken teeth. "Ran in," he called out. "He went to town," Mara said, her voice clear, betraying no fear. The man looked her up and down. "Heard he got himself some new help. You the one?" Mara said nothing. The man laughed. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "He better watch that creek. Spring melt is coming. Mr. Pike needs grazing room." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a sense of quiet menace behind them. The small patch of valley, her new sanctuary, suddenly felt exposed. Elias returned just before dusk. He was not alone. Holding his hand was a small, thin boy, wrapped in a coat that was too large for him. The boy was pale, with the large, dark eyes, the same eyes as his father. He hid behind Elias's leg, his gaze fixed on Mara with a solemn, unblinking intensity. "Micah," Elias said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "This is Mara." He had stumbled over her name, as if saying it aloud made it too real. "Hello, Micah," Mara said, kneeling. She did not reach for him. She did not crowd him. She simply made herself small, and she smiled. It was a real smile, hesitant and gentle. Micah did not smile back. He just watched. The first few days with the boy were a delicate dance. He would not speak to her. He spoke only to his father, in low murmurs. He was a quiet, watchful child, his small face already showing the lines of a learned caution. Mara did not push. She let him be. She baked. She made small, sweet biscuits with the last of their sugar. She left one on the table for him. He looked at it for a long time, then at his father, who nodded. Micah ate the biscuit, his eyes on Mara. She mended his gloves, which had a hole in the thumb. She used a small, neat stitch, reinforcing the seam. She left them by his boots. He put them on, his small fingers flexing inside the new, warm wool. One evening, Elias was skinning the rabbits from his trap line on the porch. The cabin was quiet. Mara sat by the fire, patching one of Elias's shirts. Micah sat on the floor, playing with a small, carved wooden bird. He stood up, walked over to Mara, and stood beside her. She stopped sewing. He watched the needle for a moment. Then, very slowly, as if deciding on a great risk, he put his small, chapped hand into her free one. Mara's breath caught. She did not move. She simply closed her hand around his. It was small, and warm, and trusting. She looked up and met Elias's gaze. He was standing in the open doorway, watching. His face was unreadable in the shadow, but he did not move for a long time. The small, cold cabin was suddenly full. A family of 3, bound not by blood, but by silence and a shared need. They ran low on flour. The trip to town was unavoidable. The walk down was slow, Micah walking between them. The air was warmer, and the snow was melting, revealing the hard, brown earth. Near the creek, Micah darted aside. He bent down and picked something from a patch of bare ground. He ran back and held it out to Mara. It was a single stalk of blue lupine, its color a vivid, hopeful splash against the snow. "It is for you," he whispered. It was the first thing he had ever said to her. Mara felt a stinging in her eyes. She took the flower. "It is beautiful. Micah, thank you." She tucked the stem into the simple knot of her hair. It was a small, bright decoration. When they entered the trading post, the talk stopped. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. Every man at the counter, every trapper by the stove, turned to look. Mara felt the weight of their stares, heavy and sharp as stones. She heard the whispers. "That is her. The burlap bride. $20. Look at her, got a flower in her hair. Proud of it. Seems like—" Mara's hand instinctively went to the flower. She felt her face flush hot. She wanted to pull it out, to hide. She wanted the sack back. Then she felt a presence at her side. Elias had moved. Standing so close their arms brushed, he did not look at the men. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead at Silas Dobbins, who was wiping the counter with a smirk. Elias's silence was a weapon. It was a cold, hard shield. He was not ashamed. He was not angry. He was simply there, buying flour. He stood between her and the whispers, a solid wall of quiet defiance. Mara straightened her back. She let her hand fall from her hair. She kept her chin high. She would not let them see her flinch. She had been bought, yes, but she would not be owned by their scorn. Elias paid for the flour, a bag of salt, and a small piece of hard candy, which he gave to Micah. He did not say an extra word. He gathered his goods, nodded once to the room, and they walked out. The walk back up the mountain was quiet. Mara still wore the flower. That night, the cabin felt different. It felt smaller, but stronger. It felt like a fortress, a place they had defended together. Micah was telling Mara about a fox he had seen, his voice piping and bright. He was demonstrating, his hands moving, and its tail was whoosh. Mara laughed. It was not a giggle, but a low, warm sound, full of genuine amusement. Elias, who was mending a strap by the fire, stopped. His hands went still. He had not heard laughter in this cabin since Annalise. The sound of it hit him harder than the blizzard. It was the sound of a thaw, a breaking of a long, frozen silence. Later, Micah was asleep in the big bed, buried under the furs. Mara was sitting on the small stool by the fire, mending. Elias stood by the window, looking out at the vast, moonlit snow. He spoke to the glass, his voice low. "I used to think I was free up here, away from everyone, no one to answer to." Mara stopped sewing, listening. "I had my lines, my cabin, my boy." He paused. "I had it all figured." He turned and looked at her, his face shadowed, his eyes holding a new, raw honesty. "Turns out I was just lonely. So lonely I did not even know the name for it anymore." Mara did not know what to say. She just held his gaze, her own gray eyes steady. She nodded. Once, she understood. She knew the name for it very well. The confession of loneliness hung in the air of the cabin for days. It was a seed that Elias had planted, and now they both watched to see if it would grow. The thaw had truly begun. Outside, the world was a running sound. Water dripped from the eaves. The snowpacks sighed and settled, and the creek roared, its voice changing from a frozen whisper to a full-throated command. The mountain was emerging, brown and gray and wet, from its white sleep. This new watery world brought visitors. Mason Pike's men, the same two who had surveyed the cabin from horseback, returned. This time, dismounting, Elias met them on the porch, his body placed squarely in the doorway. Mara watched from the window, her hands still in a bowl of flour. Micah, sensing the tension, stood quietly by her skirt. The man with the broken teeth was their spokesman. He did not remove his hat. "Wren, we came from Mr. Pike." Elias just waited, his hands loose at his sides. "He knows this is hard land, not much good for grazing," the man said, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the high meadow where the spring began. "He is feeling generous. He will take it off your hands. $50, cash silver, for the whole worthless plot." $50 was the price of 2 good rifles. It was an insult. Elias did not move. "The land is not for sale." The man's friendly mask slipped. He took a step closer. "You are not listening. Mountain man, that spring up there." He pointed with his chin. "It is a powerful flow in the melt. Be a shame if the main channel shifted, got wider. Be a shame if it washed this little cabin right down the valley." The threat was as clear as the running water. Pike wanted the spring. "The land," Elias said again, his voice flat and cold, "is not for sale." The man held his stare for a moment, then spat. "Have it your way. Pike gets what he wants. He always does." He and the other man mounted up and rode away, their horses churning the soft trail into mud. Mara let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She looked at Elias as he came back inside. He did not speak of it, but that evening, he took a shovel and began clearing the main drainage ditch from the spring, ensuring the water ran true, away from the cabin foundation. The thaw meant the town was more accessible. When the flour ran low again, the trip was necessary. The mood in Dobbin's post had changed. The initial shock of Elias's purchase had curdled into something meaner. Silas Dobbins, it turned out, did not like being made a fool of, and he did not like the quiet dignity with which Elias and Mara had met the town's scorn. He felt it as a personal slight. When they entered, the store was busy. Trappers and ranchers, free from the snow, were stocking up. Silas saw them, and a wide, malicious grin spread across his face. "Well, well, Wren," he boomed, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Come for more supplies." He winked at the men lined up at the counter. "Or just checking the price on flour. Heard you got a good deal on your last sack." The store erupted in laughter. It was a wet, ugly sound. Elias's face hardened. He put his hands on the counter, his knuckles white, and was about to speak. But Mara stepped forward. She moved past Elias, standing directly in front of Silas Dobbins. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was shaking, but she held her voice steady. She looked the merchant directly in the eye. "We need 10 pounds of flour and salt." Silas, surprised by her nerve, kept smiling. "Whatever you say, mistress, or is it just Mara hard to know what to call a $20 purchase?" The men laughed again. Mara took a deep breath. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply stated a fact, as solid as the mountain behind her. "My name," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the smoke, "is Mara Lorne Wren, if you must use a name." The laughter died instantly. It was a declaration. She had taken his name, the name of the mountain man, and held it up like a shield. She was not the burlap bride. She was not the sack of flour. She was Mistress Wren. She had given herself a title and a place. Silas Dobbins' smile vanished. He was left staring, his mouth open. He had been selling an object. He was now facing a person, a wife. He had no answer for that. He silently scooped the flour, weighed it, and took Elias's money, his eyes averted. They walked home in silence. But the silence was different. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her. She had not waited for him to defend her. She had defended them both. The new name, spoken aloud, settled into the cabin and made a home for itself. A few days later, Mara was at the hearth, lifting a small, cast-iron pot of stew. The handle was hot, and she misjudged her grip. She hissed, a small sound of pain, and fumbled the pot, splashing a small amount of hot liquid on her hand. Ouch! Micah, who was on the floor drawing in a patch of spilled flour, scrambled to his feet. He ran to her, his small face a mask of sudden panic. He grabbed her skirts. "Are you hurt, Mama?" The word hung in the small cabin. It was as loud as a gunshot. Micah froze, his eyes wide. He realized what he had said. He had not called anyone that name since he had learned to speak. Mara froze, the pot lid in her hand. Her own small sting was forgotten. She looked down at the boy, Elias, who was loading cartridges at the table, went perfectly still. His hand stopped moving. He did not look up. He waited. Mara set the lid down, her movements slow. She knelt, her hand still red from the heat. She looked into Micah's worried face. She did not correct him. She did not tell him he was wrong. She just smiled, a small, tired smile that reached her eyes. "I'm all right, Micah. It is just a small sting. See?" She showed him her hand. "It is already better." He looked from her face to her hand. He seemed to decide something. He leaned forward and put his small, dry lips on her red knuckles. A child's kiss. Then, satisfied, he said, "Good," and went back to his flower drawing. Mara stood up, her heart a warm, aching thing in her chest. She looked at Elias. He was still bent over his work, but his head was turned just enough that she could see his profile. He said nothing. He did not have to. The silence was an acceptance. The boy had chosen. The family had been named. The town, however, remained divided. Their stand at the store had drawn a line in the dirt. When they went down for lamp oil, they saw Mistress Cray, the widow who had cared for Micah. She walked directly to Mara, ignoring the whispers from the boardwalk. She pressed a small cloth bag into Mara's hand. "Some dried apple," she said, her voice crisp. "For the boy, he is looking better. You are a good hand with him, Mistress Wren." She used the name deliberately, loudly. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Thomas, saw Elias and nodded, a sign of deep, male respect. Wren. It was a greeting between equals. But others were not so brave. The wife of the banker, who had once nodded to Elias, saw them coming and crossed the muddy street, pretending to be fascinated by a display of harnesses. A pair of ranchers, who had business with Mason Pike, saw them and turned their backs, walking away. The community was splitting. There were those who respected boundaries and those who bowed to power. The thaw drove the work. The spring, now free of ice, was a torrent. "We have to clear the ditch," Elias said, pointing to the small channel that diverted water to a high, grassy meadow. "If we do not, the meadow floods, and I need that grass for the horse." The work became their new language. Elias used the heavy pickaxe, breaking the winter-compacted earth. His muscles moved with a lifetime of hard labor. Mara, her skirts tied up, used a smaller shovel, clearing the rocks and mud he loosened. Her hands, soft from her old life, blistered, then bled, then hardened. She never complained. She just wrapped them in rags and kept digging. Micah, feeling important, pulled at smaller weeds and branches, piling them up to be burned. They worked for 2 days, side by side. They learned the rhythm of each other's bodies. He would swing, she would stoop. He would pause, she would clear. It was a dance of shared purpose. And as they worked, digging the channel deeper, the bond between them solidified. This was not a contract made by mail. This was a partnership, sealed in mud and sweat. That evening, Elias was quiet. The work on the ditch and Pike's threat had made him think. When Micah was asleep, he pulled a tin box from under his bed. He opened it. Inside were a few papers, his parents' marriage certificate, his own and Annalise's, and a folded, yellowed deed. He spread it on the table. Mara came and stood beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is the deed," he said. He had not looked at it in years. They read it together by the light of the oil lamp. The language was old. From the territorial government. It granted him the land, 160 acres, and, in a spidery hand, all water rights appurtenant to the spring known as Wren's Creek. "There," Elias said, his finger pressing on the words. "Water rights." Mara looked at him. "He does not just want a path, does he? He wants the water." "He wants the source," Elias said, his voice grim. "This spring is the only sure water on this side of the mountain. It controls all the lower grazing. Pike's herds need it for the summer. He thought I was just a lone man he could scare off. But he was wrong." Mara said it was not a question. "He was wrong," Elias agreed. Their goals had changed. Mara had come to the cabin seeking only a roof, a place to escape scorn. Now she looked at the deed, at the sleeping boy, at the man beside her. This was not a roof. This was her home. This was her son. This was her water, and she would not let it be taken. Elias looked at her, at the smudge of dirt still on her cheek, at the set of her jaw. The loneliness he had confessed to was gone, burned away by the shared work and the quiet courage of this woman. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a husband and a father, and he felt a fierce, protective urge that was sharper than any fear. He wanted to name the feeling, this solid warmth in his chest, but he did not have the words. They were both quiet for a long time, the deed lying between them. The fire was burning low, and the cabin grew cold. Micah sighed in his sleep, burrowing deeper into the furs. Mara shivered and went to the hearth, sitting on the small stool, warming her hands. Elias did not lie down on his bedroll. He sat on it, his back against the wall, watching the embers. The silence was thick, full of unspoken things. "We will need to fence that meadow," Mara said, her voice soft, directed at the fire, "if we are to keep the grass." "Yes," Elias said. "In the morning, I will cut posts." She turned and looked at him. He was not a stranger. He was the man who had given her a choice, who had stood by her in the store, who had accepted her new name for his son. He was looking at her, his eyes clear in the firelight. Slowly, he reached out his hand. It was a large hand, rough, the knuckles scarred, the nails blunt. It was not the hand of a gentleman, but it was the hand of a steady one. He did not speak. He just held it out, palm up. Mara looked at his hand, then at his face. This was not a demand. It was an offering. It was a question, asked in the only language he knew. Slowly, she lifted her own hand, red and blistered from the day's work, and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers. His thumb moved. Just once, rubbing the rough, calloused skin of her palm. It was a promise of respect, a promise of patience, a promise of partnership. She turned her hand, her fingers lacing with his. They sat like that for a long time. The man on the floor, the woman on the stool. Their hands joined. The only sound was the breathing of the child and the settling of the fire. The cabin was warm. The next day, Elias went to the lower woods to cut timber for the fence posts. He was walking the familiar game trail, his axe on his shoulder. His mind was not fully on the task. He was thinking of Mara's hand in his. He was thinking of the word mama. He was feeling a crack in the cold, hard shell he had built around himself. He was distracted. He did not see the new dark line of metal strung between two aspen saplings, level with a man's chest. He heard the sharp, metallic clang and the snap of the spring an instant before he felt the teeth. A line of fire tore across his left shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back. A large coyote trap, its jaws vicious, had sprung shut, catching his coat and the flesh beneath. It was not set on the ground. It was strung up, deliberately, at the height of a man on the trail. This was no accident. This was not a poacher's set. With his good hand, he gritted his teeth and fought the terrible spring, prying the jaws open. The metal teeth tore free, ripping his coat and leaving a deep, bleeding gash across his shoulder and upper arm. He threw the trap to the ground. He stood, breathing heavily, pressing his hand to the wound. The blood was hot, and it ran freely through his fingers, staining the melting snow at his feet. This was Pike's answer. The threats were over. The violence had begun. The axe was gone. Elias had dropped it when the trap sprung. He pressed his right hand hard against the wound, a bright, shocking heat that spread down his arm and chest. The blood was slick, pulsing between his fingers, spilling hot onto the front of his leather coat. He looked down at the dark stain spreading on the snow, then back up the trail. He was a long walk from the cabin. This was not a mistake. This was not a trapper's carelessness. The height of the set, the strength of the spring, the placement on his own trail. It was a message. Sent by Mason Pike. He had refused the silver, so Pike had sent steel. He started walking. Each step sent a jolt of fire through his shoulder. The cold air felt good on his face, but he could feel the warmth leaving his body, running down his arm. He felt a cold, deep anger, but beneath it was a tremor. It was the old fear, the fear of being weakened, of being unable to provide, the fear of loss. He stumbled into the clearing. He saw them. Mara was showing Micah how to stack the newly cut fence posts. The boy was trying to lift one, his small face screwed up in concentration. They were a picture, a family. The sight of them, whole and safe, gave him the last push of strength. Micah saw him first. The boy dropped the wood. Papa is red." Mara looked up. Her eyes went from his face to his chest. She did not scream. She did not wring her hands. Her face went pale, but her voice was steady, practical. "Micah, go inside. Now, put the kettle on the hook. Move!" The boy, seeing the iron in her, obeyed instantly. Mara ran to Elias, meeting him halfway. She did not ask what happened. She just put her smaller, strong shoulder under his good arm. "Take a step." He leaned on her. She smelled of flour and wood smoke. She was solid. He almost fell across the threshold. He sank onto the stool, his head spinning. The cabin, which had been his fortress, suddenly felt small and vulnerable. Mara was already in motion. She pulled a clean rag from a chest, soaked it in the water bucket, and began. with a firm, impersonal efficiency. To push his torn coat and shirt away from the wound, the leather was ruined. The wool beneath was a sodden mess. "It is deep," she said. Her voice was level. "This will need sewing." She moved to the fire, heating water in a small pan. She brought back the water, more rags, and the small sewing kit she used for mending. She threaded a needle with strong, waxed linen thread. "This is not a shirt," Elias managed. His teeth gritted. "It is just cloth," she said. "Skin is just cloth." She began to clean the wound. It was a long, ragged tear. The teeth of the trap had raised the muscle. Her touch was not gentle. It was sure. It was the touch of someone who knew how to handle damaged things. As she worked, Elias watched her. He watched the concentration in her face, the way her brow furrowed. He saw her hands, which had been raw and blistered, now calloused and capable. "He said it for me," Elias whispered, his defenses shattered by the pain and the blood loss. "It was meant for my chest." "I know," Mara said, not looking up. "Hold still." He watched her hands, so steady. He thought of Annalise, of how he had held her hand while the sickness took her, how helpless he had been. He had failed to protect her. Now, Pike was on his mountain. He had failed to protect his home. He stopped, his throat thick. "I lost her. Annalise. I lost her to this mountain. To the cold. I cannot—" He could not finish the sentence. He could not name the terror. "I cannot lose again." Mara stopped. She looked up. Her gray eyes met his. The fear in the room was a living thing, cold and sharp. She had come here expecting nothing but a roof. She had found a boy who called her Mama. She had found a man who treated her like a person. She went back to her work, the needle piercing his skin. He flinched. "You did not rescue me." "Elias," she said, her voice low and fierce. Her words were timed to her stitches. "He bought the bride no one wanted. That is what they say. But you did not save me. You gave me a choice. You gave me a home." She tied off the thread, her hands quick. "You are not losing this. We are not losing this." She packed the wound with a poultice of herbs and bound it tight with a clean strip of linen. The wound and the fear was now sealed between them. A fever set in that night. Elias lay on the big bed, the furs piled high. Mara sat on the stool, sleeping in fits, waking to give him water, to check the bandage. For 2 days, the cabin was a still, sick place. The only sound, the low murmur of his fever and the quiet movements of Mara and Micah. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Elias woke, his mind clear, his shoulder a block of solid, throbbing pain. Mara was asleep on the stool, her head on the table. Micah was asleep on Elias's old bedroll by the fire, the one Elias would never use again. He saw them, his family, and the cold anger returned. It was broken by a knock. It was Mistress Cray, breathless from the climb, her face flushed with anger. "Elias," she said, rushing in, not bothering with pleasantries. "You have to come to town. Pike, he is not just using traps. He is using paper." Mara was awake now, offering the woman water. Mistress Cray waved it away. "He has posted a notice. At the saloon, and at the post. He is claiming water rights. He has some old territorial map. Says your spring is part of his lower grazing land." Elias sat up, the movement sending a jolt of pain through him. "The deed. The deed says the water is mine." "That is the other part," Mistress Cray said, her voice dropping. "Silas Dobbins. He has signed a paper, an affidavit, swearing he has seen Pike's map, and that it is the true one. He is telling everyone your deed is a forgery." The room was cold. This was a deeper, more dangerous trap. "And," Mistress Cray added, her eyes meeting Mara's, "he is attacking you. He is telling the town your marriage is not real, that you never filed papers with the pastor, that you are just a hired woman. He is telling them that a temporary woman, a burlap bride, has no standing, that your word and his means nothing. It was a brilliant, cruel strategy. Pike was not just trying to take the land, he was trying to take their name. Elias threw the furs off. "I am going." "You are not," Mara said. "You cannot even stand." She looked at Mistress Cray. "He is telling them I am temporary." "Yes," Mistress Cray said, her face grim. "He is undoing the name you claimed." Mara walked to the wall, to the peg where her old, thin coat hung. She took it down. Underneath it, stuffed in the corner, was the burlap sack. She pulled it out. It was dusty and stiff. Elias, his face pale, watched her. "Mara, what are you doing?" "You are hurt," she said, her voice quiet. "You cannot fight steel, so I will go fight the lies." She folded the sack under her arm. "Mara, do not—" She turned and looked at him, her eyes holding that same stubborn dignity he had seen the first day. "He called me a sack of flour," she said. "He can see his flour again." She walked out the door, alone. The walk to town was long. She did not feel the cold. She felt a hot, bright anger. She was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Micah. She was fighting for the man in the bed, the man who had been lonely, the man who was tied to her now by blood and linen thread. She walked into the trading post. The stove was roaring. The usual crowd of men was there. Silas Dobbins was behind the counter, holding a cup of coffee, telling a story. "So, Pike says, the man is a squatter, and his wife, she is just a $20. Mr. Dobbins." Her voice cut the air. Every man turned. Silas froze, his cup halfway to his mouth. Mara walked to the counter. She was not shaking. She was a pillar of cold fire. She unfolded the burlap sack and threw it onto the counter. It landed with a dusty thud, scattering a pile of loose change. The room was dead silent. "You sold this," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. "You sold it to Elias Wren. You took his 20 silver dollars. You called it a final sale." Silas Dobbins stared at the sack, then at her. His face was turning a dark red. "You sold him a wife," Mara continued, her voice rising. "I am that wife. He paid your price. Now, you stand in the saloon, and you stand here, and you say I am not a wife. You say I am temporary. You say the sale was not real." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the counter. The men were holding their breath. "Which is it, Mr. Dobbins? You cannot have it both ways. Are you a swindler who sells false goods, or are you a liar who denies his own sale?" Silas had no answer. He was trapped. She had used his own greed against him. From the back of the room, a heavy voice boomed. "She is right. Silas." Thomas, the blacksmith, stepped forward. He was a mountain of a man, his face permanently smudged with soot. "A sale is a sale. You took the man's silver. You cannot now deny the goods. It is bad business." "And," Mistress Cray said, stepping up beside Mara, "I was here. I saw it, and I have been to that cabin. I saw a sick boy made well. I saw a home fire burning. That is as real as any paper you ever signed. Silas Dobbins, and a sight more honest." A third man stepped out of the shadows. "Pastor Allen." His voice was mild, but it carried authority. "This is a grievous matter. A man's land, and his family. These rumors must stop. There will be a community meeting, tomorrow, at sundown, in the church hall. We will hear from Mr. Wren, and we will hear from Mr. Pike, and we will see these papers. All of them." The crowd murmured. The tide had turned. Silas Dobbins looked from the pastor to the blacksmith to Mara. He was no longer the one in charge. Mara picked up her sack, folded it, and walked out. She returned to the cabin to find Elias on his feet, dressed. He was pale, his arm in a sling Mara had made, but his eyes were clear. "I heard the pastor. He said he had been standing on the porch, listening." The victory was small, And it did not last. That evening, as Mara was preparing supper, she sent Micah to the spring for a bucket of water. It was a short trip. He had done it 100 times. He was gone too long. Mara, Elias. Her voice was a knife of fear. Elias grabbed his rifle with his good hand. They ran out the door. They found him. He was standing frozen, 10 feet from the cabin, by the path to the spring. He was white as the snow, pointing. A trap, a massive wolf trap, its jaws black and open, was hidden in the mud. It was staked to the ground, lightly covered with leaves. It was right in Micah's path. Pike's men had been there, while she was in town. While Elias was wounded, they had come onto his land, near his home, and set a trap for his son. Elias's face was a terrible thing to see. The rage was so cold it seemed to burn. He walked past Micah, his rifle raised. "I will end this." Mara grabbed the rifle barrel. Her hands were shaking. "No, Elias, this is what he wants. He wants you to be the animal. He wants you to shoot one of his men. Then the law will hang you, and he will take Micah. He will take the water. He wins." Elias strained against her, his good arm trembling. "He threatened my son." "And we will fight him," Mara said, her eyes pleading. "But not like this. Not his way, our way." Slowly, his breathing slowed. The madness in his eyes receded. He looked at Micah, who was now weeping silently. He let the rifle go. He turned, walked back inside. His boots heavy. He went to the tin box and took out the deed. His deed. "You are right," he said. He put on his coat, his face a mask of pained resolve. "Where are you going?" "To Pastor Allen. He said he would hold the papers. He will hold this. He will keep it safe until the meeting. He will not fight with steel. He would fight with honor." When he returned, the cabin was quiet. The sun was setting. The meeting was hours away. The three of them sat at the table. Mara knew what to do. She got up. She put wood on the fire. She took out the last of the flour, the last of the rabbit. She began to cook. The cabin filled with the smell of baking bread and hot stew. It was a meal of defiance. It was a courage meal. They ate, the kitchen, their war room. "I will speak," Elias said. "I will show the deed. And Mistress Cray and Thomas will speak for us," Mara said, "for our family." Micah looked at his father, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Are we going to lose our home, Papa?" Elias put his good hand on the boy's hair. "No, son, we are not losing our home." He looked across the table at Mara. She was watching him, her face tired but strong. "You said you were free," she said softly, "because you were not tied to anyone." Elias looked at his son. He looked at the woman who had faced down a trading post for him. He felt the throb in his shoulder, the warmth of the bread. He reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was scarred. Hers was blistered. They fit together. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough. "Freedom is not being untied. It is choosing what you will be tied to." They sat, their hands joined, the stew steaming between them. Outside, the dark settled. In the valley, the lamps were being lit in the church hall. The town was gathering. The church hall was not truly a church. It was a long log building with a raised platform at one end and a cold pot-bellied stove in the middle. It served for sermons on Sunday, town meetings on Tuesday, and dances when a fiddler passed through. Tonight, it was a courtroom. It was packed. Men stood 3 deep against the walls, their breath fogging the cold air. The lamps had all been lit, casting a hot, yellow, flickering light that smelled of kerosene. The benches were full. People sat shoulder to shoulder, a solid mass of wet wool and simmering tension. When Elias walked in, the room went silent. Every head turned. He held his left arm in the linen sling Mara had made. Micah, his face pale and his eyes wide, held his father's good hand. Mara walked beside them. She was not hiding. She held her head high, her gaze fixed forward. They were a family, walking into a fight. Pastor Allen gestured them to the front bench. It was a place of honor, and a place of exposure. Across the aisle, Mason Pike sat, flanked by his 2 hired men. Pike was smiling, a thin, cold smile. He looked relaxed, as if he were merely waiting for a freight delivery. Beside him, looking nervous and important, was Silas Dobbins. He had a stack of papers on his lap. Pastor Allen stood on the platform. He was a small, practical man who understood that God's will was often decided by a majority vote. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice filling the hall. "We are here to settle a dispute, a hard one. It is about land, it is about water, and it is about our community. We will hear from Mr. Pike, and we will hear from Mr. Wren. We will be civil. We will be fair. Mr. Dobbins, you may present Mr. Pike's claim." Silas Dobbins stood. He relished the attention. He unrolled a large, new-looking map and tacked it to the wall. "Friends, it is a simple matter of surveying," he said, his voice slick. "Mr. Pike, in his generosity, has had this entire valley properly mapped, as you can see." He pointed with a stick. "The spring on the high ridge, which Mr. Wren has been using, clearly and legally, falls within the boundaries of Mr. Pike's lower grazing lands." He then held up another paper. "And this is my sworn affidavit, as postmaster, that I have seen Mr. Pike's original deed, and this map is a true and accurate copy." A man in the back muttered, "Since when are you a surveyor?" "Silas." Silas ignored him. "The law is the law. Mr. Wren, while a good neighbor, has been squatting on land that is not his paper, which the pastor holds, is an old, unofficial claim, worth nothing. Furthermore," he paused, letting the drama build, "his claim to residency is thin. He has no legal wife, no family bond recognized by the law. He has only temporary, hired help." The insult hung in the hot air. Elias started to rise, his face dark, but Mara put her hand on his good arm. "Not yet." Pastor Allen looked at Elias. "Mr. Wren." Elias stood. He was unsteady from the blood loss, but his voice was clear. "I am not a squatter. My father worked that land. I was born in that cabin." He looked at the pastor. "You have my deed." Pastor Allen nodded. He unrolled the old, yellowed, creased document. He held it up. "This is the original territorial deed, granted to Ezra Wren and passed to his son, Elias." He read the words aloud, his voice echoing, 160 acres, and he squinted. "All water rights appurtenant to the spring known as Wren's Creek." A murmur went through the crowd. The name was right there, Wren's Creek. Silas Dobbins laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "A name, just a name. My map is a legal survey. That is just a note." Before Elias could answer, Thomas the blacksmith stood up. His voice was a low rumble, like stones in a riverbed. "I am not a map man," he said, his arms crossed. "But I know what I see. I saw those 2 men." He pointed directly at Pike's hired hands, riding Mr. Pike's horses, up on Wren's land. "I saw them measuring, and I saw them, a month ago, pulling down Wren's fence line. Men who pull down fences are not mistaken about boundaries. They are thieves." Pike's men looked at him, their faces hard. Thomas stared back, unblinking. Then Mistress Cray stood. Her voice was sharp as a needle. "And I have something to say about this temporary help. Elias Wren left his boy, Micah, with me." The boy was sick with a fever. Elias was half mad with worry. He came to town for medicine and supplies. That is when he met Mistress Wren. He did not buy a woman. He saved one, and he brought her to his son. And I have seen that boy. He was a ghost. Now, he is a boy. That is not temporary. That is a family. And you, Silas Dobbins, are a liar to call it anything else." The room was buzzing. Pike's thin smile had faded. This was not going as planned. Silas Dobbins held up his hands, his face turning red. "This is not about fences or feelings. It is about the law. I am an officer of this town. My word is my bond. My signature is on that affidavit." Mara Lorne Wren stood up. The room, which had been buzzing, fell into a profound, shocked silence. The burlap bride, the $20 woman, she was going to speak. Micah, sensing the tension, pressed his face into his father's good leg. Mara's voice was not loud. It was low, and it was clear, and every person in the hall leaned forward to hear it. "Mr. Dobbins." Silas looked at her, his eyes full of spite. "You are right," she said. "Your word is your bond." She walked from the bench into the center aisle. So she was standing between the two sides. She was small and pale, but her spine was straight. "You sold me. You sold me to Elias Wren, right in your store. You took $20 silver from his hand. You called me goods. You called me a strong back. You made a sale, Mr. Dobbins. You gave your word, and you took his silver. A sale is a sale." Silas was speechless. He remembered her standing in his store, her voice just like this. She took a step closer to him. "Now, you stand here. You sell your oath to Mr. Pike. You sell your signature. You tell this town that the sale you made was not real. You tell them I am not a wife. You tell them my name is not my own." She paused, and her voice was a sharp, clear bell. "I have to ask you, Mr. Dobbins, which is it? Do you sell your oath every day? Or was the first sale, the one for me, a lie? Are you a swindler who sells false goods? Or are you a liar who denies his own bond?" It was a perfect trap. Silas sputtered. He looked from Mara to the crowd, and he saw no friendly faces. He saw only judgment. He saw his reputation, his power as the town's merchant, evaporating. That is not fair," he stammered. "I was paid for my expert testimony. That is a legal thing. The silver Mr. Pike gave me, it was for my time, for my expertise with maps and deeds." He stopped. The words hung in the hot, oily air. A man in the back, a small rancher named Jedediah, stood up. What did he say? "He said he was paid." Someone else shouted. Jedediah's voice was cold. "Paid by who?" "Paid by Pike. Pike paid you for your testimony. Silas." The room exploded. The community, which had been a quiet collection of families, became a single, angry voice. "He is a hired liar." "Pike bought his witness." "That affidavit is not worth the spit on it." Silas Dobbins' face went white. He had said it. In his panic, he had confessed. The mask was not just cracked. It had fallen to the floor. Mason Pike stood up. His face was no longer smiling. It was a mask of cold, white rage. His civilized tools, his money and his lies, had just been broken. "This meeting is over," he snarled. "We will settle this with the marshal." He gestured to his men. "Not to the door, to Elias." The two men moved. One shoved Thomas the blacksmith, who was in his way. Thomas shoved back, a sound like a side of beef hitting a wall. The other man, the one with the broken teeth, lunged for the front bench. It was chaos. Men were shouting, benches toppled, women screamed. Micah cried out, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He scrambled off the bench and buried his face in Mara's skirts, his small hands grabbing her legs. Mara did not run. She stood, pulling the boy tight, turning her back to the violence, shielding him with her own body. Pike's man reached Elias. He grabbed for the front of his shirt. Elias stood. He did not have his rifle. His arm was in a sling. He was wounded and unarmed. He planted his feet. He was a block of granite. He was the mountain. He looked the man in the eye, and he said, his voice low and final, "No." The man, stunned by the absolute lack of fear, paused. In that second, Elias looked past him. He looked at Mason Pike. He looked at the entire chaotic room. "This is my land," he said. His voice was not a shout, but it cut through the noise. "This is my son!" He put his good hand on Mara's shoulder, a gesture of absolute possession, of partnership. "This is my wife." He looked at Pike. "We are not temporary. We are not for sale. We are not squatters." He paused, and his voice filled the sudden, awed silence, a simple declaration of truth. "We belong here, and we belong to each other." The moment stretched. The man with the broken teeth looked from Elias to Mara and the child, to the crowd. He was alone. Thomas the blacksmith was right behind him, his face a thundercloud. Jedediah, the downstream rancher, stepped into the aisle. "He is right." He looked at Pike. "If you can buy an oath to steal Wren's spring, you can buy one to steal my water tomorrow, and your water the day after." Another woman's voice, sharp with rage, pierced the air. "And what about the trap? The trap set on his trail. The trap set for that boy. We are farmers and ranchers, Mr. Pike. We are not men who hunt children." The crowd, which had been a frightened mob, now had a focus. They were not looking at Elias. They were looking at Pike. They began to move, not as a mob, but as a community. They formed a solid, silent wall between Pike and the family at the front. Thomas the blacksmith put one huge, sooty hand on the chest of Pike's hired man. "Sit down." Pastor Allen stood on the platform, and his face was stern. "Mr. Pike, this community does not recognize your claim. We recognize the deed of Elias Wren." He looked at Silas Dobbins, who was trying to slide out the back door. "And Silas, your testimony is false, bought and paid for. Your position as postmaster, as a holder of the public trust, is over." Thomas added, his voice a low growl, "And he will pay for the fence he tore down, and for the trap that cut Elias Wren." Mason Pike looked at the wall of hard, unforgiving faces. He had misjudged them. He had mistaken their quietness for weakness. He had lost. He gestured to his men. "We are leaving." "You will pay for the damages first," Jedediah said. Pike's face was a mask of hatred. He took a heavy pouch from his belt and threw it on the floor. The coins scattered. "This town is finished," he snarled. He stalked out of the hall, his men pushing through the crowd behind him. The door slammed shut. In the sudden, heavy silence, Silas Dobbins, pale and shaking, slipped out the back. It was over. There had been no gunfight, no duel in the street. It was a victory won with truth and courage, and the plain, rustic justice of a community that had finally been pushed too far. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. The strength that had held him up drained away. He leaned heavily on the back of the bench, his wounded shoulder screaming. Mara turned, her arms still wrapped around Micah. The boy peeked out. The shouting was gone. His father was still standing. Mistress Cray came forward and put a warm hand on Mara's arm. "It is done. Child," she said, her voice thick. "It is done. You are home." The climb back up the mountain was slow. The victory in the church hall felt thin, a brittle thing that could shatter. Elias leaned on Mara, his good right arm around her shoulder, his left arm bound tight in the sling. The wound throbbed with every step. Micah held Mara's other hand, his small face pale in the moonlight. They were a three-legged stool, unsteady but whole, making their way home. They were not alone for the first mile. Thomas the blacksmith and Jedediah, the downstream rancher, walked with them, carrying lanterns. Their presence was a silent guard. "You are good neighbors," Elias said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Thomas just grunted. Pike was a fool. He pushed on a man, then he pushed on a family, then he pushed on a town. A man can push one. He cannot push all three. Jedediah nodded. "We will send word to the county seat. Get a deputy up here. Pike might be gone, but his type of trouble lingers." They parted ways at the lower fork, the two townsmen turning back toward the valley lights. Elias, Mara, and Micah continued up the dark trail. into the vast, cold silence of the mountain. The cabin was dark. It was a black, cold shape against the stars. It was their fortress. They stumbled inside. Mara lit the lamp, her hands shaking with weariness. The small room, with its familiar smells of pine and yeast, was the safest place on earth. Micah was asleep before his boots were off. He had been strong for too long. Mara lifted him into the big bed, covering him with the heavy furs. Elias sat on the stool by the cold hearth, his head in his good hand. The pain in his shoulder was a white fire. Mara put a fresh log on the embers. She would heat water. She needed to check the bandage. She moved to the wood pile. She stopped. She turned her head. "What is that smell?" Elias looked up. "Wood smoke." "No!" Mara's voice was sharp, a new fear cutting through her exhaustion. "Not the hearth. It is sharp, oily." Elias pushed himself to his feet. He knew that smell. It was the smell of dry grass burning, of pine needles catching. He moved to the door and pulled it open. The world was not dark. The sky to the north over the high meadow was a sickening, flickering orange. A column of dark smoke, lit from below, rose into the night. "He is burning us out." Elias's voice was a dead, flat thing. Mason Pike had not gone to the bridge. He, or his men, had come back up the mountain. He had lost the fight with paper, so he was finishing it with fire. Mara ran outside. The wind, which had been calm, was picking up. A cruel, downslope breeze. It was pushing the fire down the mountain, down from the high meadow, toward the spring, toward the cabin. "Elias, it is moving fast." The fire that had warmed their home, cooked their bread, and symbolized their life together was now a monster. The hearth was comfort. This was annihilation. Mara grabbed the empty water buckets. "The stream. We need wet sacks." Elias followed her. He was clumsy, one-handed. He grabbed a shovel, his good right arm straining. "Micah, wake up." The boy stumbled out of the bed, his eyes wide with sleep and terror. The fire was a living thing. It was a roaring, crackling beast, eating the dry spring grass that he had planned to fence. It was already at the edge of the woods. "Micah!" Mara yelled, her voice a sharp command that cut through the roar. "Take the small pot. Run to the stream. Fill it. Bring it to me. Do not stop. Do not look at the fire. Look at the water. Go." The boy, given a task, moved. His terror was channeled into a frantic, repetitive motion. Elias ran to the fire line. He dug with his one good arm, trying to turn the earth, to make a break. The smoke was a solid wall. It tore at his lungs, made his eyes stream. The heat was scorching, blistering his face. Mara soaked 2 of the burlap feed sacks in the creek. They were heavy, dripping. She ran to the fire, beating at the edges, trying to smother the hungry flames. It was hopeless. The wind was too strong. For every flame she beat out, a dozen new ones leaped up, laughing at her. "Easy." Elias stopped, his shovel mid-swing. That was not the wind. It was a shout. Through the smoke, dark shapes were moving. Men. Thomas the blacksmith emerged, his face grim, a heavy axe in his hand. Jedediah was right behind him, with 2 other ranchers. They were carrying shovels, axes, and more wet sacks. "Did you think we would let you fight this alone?" Thomas roared over the flames. "Pike is a snake, and you have to cut off its head. But first, you have to put out its fire." The community had not gone home. They had seen the glow. They had known. The battle began in earnest. It was not one man and one woman. It was a line of neighbors. They formed a chain. Micah, small and determined, passed his pot of water to Mistress Cray, who had arrived. Her face set, and she filled the buckets that the men soaked the sacks in. They were building a fire break, a wide scar of raw earth between the cabin and the advancing flames. Elias worked beside Thomas, his useless arm a burning weight, his good arm a piston of digging and throwing dirt. Mara was a fury. She was everywhere, beating at rogue sparks that jumped the line, hauling water, her face black with soot, her hair coming unbound. They were holding it. The wind was high, but the line of dark, wet earth was wider. The fire hit the brake and sputtered, angry, seeking fuel. Then the wind turned. It did not just shift, it swirled, a sudden, violent downdraft from the high peaks. It lifted a massive sheet of burning embers and sparks, a cloud of orange devils, and threw it over their heads. The sparks rained down on the dry patch of woods behind them, between the firebreak and the cabin. A new firewall exploded into life, rising 30 feet high in an instant. And Mara was on the wrong side. Elias saw it. He saw the wall of flame erupt. He saw her frozen for a second, her wet sack held uselessly in her hand. Mara! His scream was not a word. It was the sound of his soul tearing. She was trapped, a ring of fire. She dropped to her knees, the smoke a thick, choking blanket. Elias did not think. He was not a man with one arm. He was not wounded. He was just the man who had to get to her. He grabbed a soaking, dripping horse blanket from Jedediah. He wrapped it around his head, his good arm holding it in place. "Ren, Thomas yelled, grabbing for him. Elias shook him off and ran. He ran directly into the wall of flame. The heat was an agony. It was a physical blow. His hair, his eyebrows, were gone in an instant. The wet wool of the blanket smoked, scorching his skin. He could not breathe. He was blind. He found her. She was on the ground, curled, no longer moving. He fell on her, covering her body with his own, shielding her with the blanket. He grabbed her shirt, her arm, with his good hand. He hauled her up. She was a dead weight. He dragged her, step by agonizing step, his boots melting, his lungs screaming for air. He put all his strength, all his fear, all his love into that one good arm. He pulled her back through the wall of fire. He fell out of the smoke, landing on the blackened, safe side of the break. He was still covering her. He was not moving. Thomas and Jedediah were on them, pulling the smoking blanket off. Mara coughed, a deep, racking, tearing sound. She was alive. She was breathing. Elias rolled off her. He lay on his back, his chest heaving, his eyes closed. His wounded shoulder was bleeding again. The bandage burned away. The wound opened to the night, but he was smiling. Shouts echoed from the trail below. New lights. A man on a horse, with a silver star on his chest, a deputy marshal. He was not alone. He had 3 ranchers with him, and they were holding 2 men, their hands tied. The deputy took in the scene, the fire, the exhausted line of citizens, the 2 people on the ground. "What in God's name?" he said. Jedediah pointed. "Pike." He tried to burn them out. At that moment, the wind, as if its work was done, shifted again. It blew hard from the south, pushing the fire back up the mountain, back onto the land it had already burned, up toward the bare rock of the high ridge. The cabin was safe. The spring was safe. The deputy looked at the 2 men he held. One of them, the man with the broken teeth, was shaking. "You 2 set this," the deputy demanded. The man broke. He was terrified of the fire, terrified of the crowd. "Yes, but Pike paid us. He paid us to set the fire, to burn the mountain man out. He told us to run for the bridge. He would meet us." "Would." The deputy's face was hard as granite. "Where is Mason Pike now?" "He is on the bridge trail," Jedediah yelled. "He is running." "I have 2 men on that bridge," the deputy said, his voice cold. "He will not cross the river. He is finished." He gestured to the captured arsonists. "Take them to town. Lock them in the smithy. They can tell their story to a judge." The fire, its master captured, its purpose lost, began to die. It found the rocks of the high ridge and starved. The townspeople did not cheer. They were too tired. They were covered in soot, their hands blistered. They just watched the flames recede. They had held the line. One by one, they came by, Thomas clapped Elias on his good shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. Mistress Cray touched Mara's hair, her hand gentle. They left, a quiet, exhausted procession moving back down the trail. Elias, Mara, and Micah were alone again. They stood, wrapped in blankets, and watched the high meadows smoke. The grass was gone. The pasture was a black, ugly scar on the mountain. It was a ruin. But the cabin stood. The moonlight glinted on the stream, which bubbled and ran, clean and cold, untouched by the ash. The fire had tested them, had tried to destroy them, but the house stood. The water ran. The family was whole. They went inside. The cabin was a sanctuary. Mara lit the lamp. Micah, in a state of shock, sat at the table and fell asleep, his head on his arms, his face black with soot. Mara turned to Elias. She did not say anything. She got the water basin. She got the last clean rags. Her hands were shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. She began to clean his face, the soot, the ash. Then she looked at his shoulder. The wound was raw, burned, bleeding. She began to clean it, her touch light. He sat on the bedroll, his back against the wall. He was shaking, too. It was the cold, the shock, the adrenaline leaving him. When she was done, she did not move away. She sank onto the stool, her whole body trembling. He reached out his good hand. He did not speak. Mara moved from the stool. She sat on the bedroll beside him, careful of his wound. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his chest. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He held her. They just sat in the quiet cabin, holding each other, trembling. She pressed her ear to his shirt. She could hear his heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was steady. It was strong. It was alive. They stayed like that for a long time. The only sound, the quiet breathing of the sleeping child. Elias spoke, his voice a low rasp against the crown of her hair. I have been alone up here for 3 years. Since Annalise, I thought this mountain. He gestured to the door, to the black, scarred world outside. I thought it was my only friend, my only home. He pulled her closer, his grip tight. I was wrong. It is just rock. It is just dirt. He put his hand under her chin, lifting her face, her gray eyes, smudged with soot, met his. You, he whispered. You and the boy. You are my home, Mara. The morning after the fire was a terrible birth. The sun rose on a world scrubbed clean of life. The high meadow was a smoking, black scar. The smell of ash and ozone was a physical weight, a gray powder that covered everything. Elias stood on the porch, his good arm holding Micah. Mara stood beside him, her hands, raw and burned, clasped in front of her. They looked at the ruin of their pasture. The grass was gone. The new fence posts were charcoal. It was a profound, silent defeat. They had won the battle in the town, but the mountain, their home, was wounded. Elias, his voice a hoarse rasp, spoke to the smoking ground. I will have to find new grazing, miles north, or sell the horse. They stood there for a long time, 3 small figures against a vast, black landscape. Then they heard a sound. It was the scrape of a wagon wheel on the trail. Jedediah, the downstream rancher, was driving his mule team up the path. His wagon was loaded. Thomas the blacksmith was beside him, and 3 other men from the valley walked behind. Jedediah pulled the wagon to a stop. His eyes took in the black meadow. He nodded. Once. Bad business. He gestured to the wagon bed. It was full of new cut pine posts and sacks. Thomas hefted a heavy sack and dropped it at Elias's feet. It was seed. Ryegrass. Tough. Grows fast in high country. Elias looked at the men. He looked at the seed. He could not speak. Jedediah climbed down. We are not letting that murdering thief have the last word. He clapped Elias on his good shoulder. Careful of the wound. You cannot reseed this alone. Ren, not with one arm, and a man with neighbors should not have to. The work began. It was not a cleanup, it was a resurrection. The men, with Elias directing, began digging new post holes, clearing the burned stumps, their movements practiced and strong. Mistress Cray arrived, carrying a basket. She had Micah organize the children who had tagged along, Jedediah's daughter and the blacksmith's son. She gave them small bags of seed. They walked in a line, like small soldiers, tossing the seed onto the rake dash. Mara worked beside them, her burned hands wrapped in rags. She brought water. She brought the last of their bread, which they shared, sitting on the ground, a community of soot-stained faces. The work was hard, and it lasted for 2 days. They rebuilt the fence, stronger than before. They redug the irrigation ditch that Pike's men had damaged. They seeded the entire meadow, from the spring down to the woods. On the final afternoon, Mara was walking the edge of the new fence line. She found a small, sheltered patch of green near the stream, a place the fire had leaped over. A small cluster of blue lupines, their color a defiant shout against the black, had survived. She knelt, and with her bare hands, she carefully dug them up, keeping the roots in a ball of earth. She carried them to the top of the meadow, near the spring. Micah ran to her, and together they found a spot near the head of the stream. They replanted the flowers. It was a small, quiet promise. They were tending the land, and the land, they prayed, would tend them. Weeks passed. The mountain healed. The wind and rain washed the ash, and a faint, hopeful fuzz of green began to show on the high meadow. Elias's shoulder healed, the ragged tear knitting into a long, silver scar. He regained the use of his arm, though it would always be stiff in the cold. They had to go to town for flour and salt, their larder empty after feeding the work crew. The town felt different. The air was cleaner. They walked into the trading post. Silas Dobbins was behind the counter, but he was not smiling. He was not telling stories. He was stacking tins, his face sallow and drawn. The store was empty. No one was at the stove. No one was at the counter. Elias put his list on the plank. Silas gathered the items, his movements small and defeated. He did not meet their eyes. He did not speak. He just took the money. As they left, they saw Pastor Allen nailing a notice to the church door. He saw them and smiled, a real smile. Mistress Wren, Mr. Wren, he gestured to the notice. You will be glad to know, the town council has voted this bride trade. It is over. We will not be trafficking in people in this valley. Not anymore. Mara looked at the notice. The town, shamed by Silas and Pike, was changing its own rules. And what of Mr. Pike? Elias asked, his voice low. The law is slow, the pastor said, but it grinds true. The deputy marshal took his testimony, and the testimony of his men. Pike was fined, heavily. His assets in this county are seized to pay for the new seed, the lumber, and for the deputy's time. He has been encouraged to find another county to conduct his business. He will not be back. The justice was simple, rustic, and complete. As they walked down the boardwalk, a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid them stopped. She was one of the rancher's wives. She nodded to Mara. Mistress Wren, it is good to see you in town. Mara nodded back. And you, Mistress Brown. The name was spoken simply, without scorn, without pity. It was just her name. The children, who had once stared at the burlap bride, now just saw Micah. Jedediah's daughter? Mary ran up. Micah? We are playing by the creek. Do you want to come? Micah looked at Mara. She smiled and nodded. Go on. He ran off, his laughter, which was once so rare, now loud and free. He was no longer a shadow. He was a boy. Mara and Elias sat on the bench outside the post, waiting for him. The sun was warm. Mara, her voice soft in the afternoon air, began to hum a small, simple tune, a song she remembered from her childhood. The children by the creek stopped their play to listen. Back at the cabin, the new rhythm of their life took hold. Micah, full of a new, bright energy, wanted to be part of everything. He followed Elias to check the trap lines. He followed Mara to the spring. One morning, he stood at the table while Mara was mixing dough. "Mama, I want to do it." Mara, who had come to love the sound of that word, smiled. "It is hard work," she warned. "I am strong," he insisted. She gave him a small piece of dough. He punched it. He kneaded it. He got flour in his hair and on his nose. He was a small, laughing, dusty mess. The cabin, which had been a place of quiet, grim survival, was now a place of joyful, noisy life. The family, born of a blizzard and forged in fire, was whole. One afternoon, Elias was outside, splitting wood. Micah was down by the stream. Mara was alone in the cabin, tidying, in the corner, stuffed behind a box. She found it. The burlap sack, the one she had carried to town, her symbol of defiance. She pulled it out. It was just a feed sack, dusty, stained. She held it in her hands. It was the skin of a life she no longer lived. It was the mark of her shame, her rejection, and, in a strange way, her liberation. She walked to the hearth. The iron stove was hot, the fire inside roaring. She lifted the heavy iron lid, the heat washing her face. She looked at the sack one last time. Then she fed it into the flames. She watched it catch. The fibers darkened, curled, and then erupted in a bright, clean fire. It was gone in moments, collapsing into white ash. She put the lid back on the stove, the clang of the iron a final, punctuating sound. She turned. Elias was standing in the doorway. He had seen. He did not speak. He just looked at her, at the stove, and he nodded. He understood. The past was burned. Their life together found its shape. They were partners. The work was divided, and it was shared. They talked about everything. Where to plant the small garden, how much wood was needed for the winter, how to budget the small amount of money they had. The cabin was small. The large bed, the one Annalise had slept in, was now their bed. The bedroll Elias had used was gone, stowed away. At night, they lay side by side, tired from the work, the small form of Micah a warm lump in the cradle, which they had pulled close. It was a good cradle, strong and safe, and it fit him perfectly for now. Their intimacy was not one of fevered passion. It was the intimacy of shared survival. It was his good hand finding hers in the dark. It was her head resting on his good shoulder. It was the quiet, unspoken agreement that they were in this together. It was a relationship built on honesty and respect, and the hard, undeniable truth of their shared life. The mail, which now ran to a new postmaster in the valley, brought a letter. Mara saw the handwriting on the envelope, and her blood ran cold. It was from her uncle. She opened it with trembling hands. Elias watched, his face creased with concern. It was not a letter of apology. It was a letter of finance. Her uncle had heard, through some distant rumor, that she had married well to a landowner. He was in debt. He needed money. He reminded her of all he had done for her, of his generosity. The old Mara would have wept. She would have felt the crushing weight of that old, toxic obligation. Mara Lorne Wren just read the letter. She felt nothing, no anger, no shame, just a distant, hollow pity for a man so small. She did not send him money. She did not have any. But she did not send him hate. She went to the pantry. She took a small amount of flour, a little salt, and she baked a batch of hard, dry journey biscuits, the kind that would last a long time. She wrapped them in a piece of clean paper. She wrote a note. It was only 3 sentences. "I am safe. I am well. I hope this finds you in health." She did not sign it with a name. She sent it off with the next mail rider. She had broken the cycle. She would not send back the pain she had been given. She would send back simply bread. That night, the cabin was quiet. The day's work was done. Elias sat at the table, repairing a piece of harness, his hands sure and capable. Micah was on the floor, asleep, his head on a rolled-up blanket, a small, carved bird clutched in his hand. The kettle on the stove was singing. It was a soft, steady sound. Mara poured 2 cups of hot water, steeping a bit of mint she had found by the spring. The wind had turned. It was a spring wind now, soft and warm. It came down from the high meadow, and it smelled of new, green grass. It smelled of the lupines they had planted. The window, which had been barred against the blizzard, was open. The soft wind moved the curtain, a gentle, breathing motion. Mara handed Elias his cup. She sat across from him. They did not need to speak. The silence was full. It was the sound of the kettle, the soft breath of the wind, the quiet sleep of their son. It was the sound of a normal life. It was the sound of peace. The spring was a celebration. It was not just a thaw. It was a rebirth. The high meadow, which had been a black, smoking wound, was now a tapestry of bright, improbable green. The rye seed had taken root, fed by the ash and the melting snow. The creek, Wren's Creek, ran full and clear, its voice a constant, happy shout. In the valley, the town decided to hold a festival. It was a new idea, born of the hard winter and the near disaster. Pastor Allen called it the Spring Water Welcome, a day to give thanks for the water that gave them all life, the water they had almost lost to greed. Long tables were built outside the church hall. The entire valley came. Families brought what they had: smoked hams, jars of pickled vegetables, pies, and pots of beans. It was a feast of survival. From the mountain, they saw the smoke of the cook fires. Elias, Mara, and Micah came down the trail. Elias walked tall, his shoulder healed. His strength returned. Micah, no longer a pale shadow, ran ahead, chasing a butterfly. Mara walked beside her husband, her step light. She carried a large basket. In it were 3 loaves of her bread, dark and fragrant, and a large tin of coffee, a luxury she had insisted they buy. When they reached the clearing, the music of a lone fiddle stopped. The conversations paused. Every face turned to them. It was the first time they had come to town not for supplies, not for a fight, but for a celebration. Pastor Allen and Jedediah walked over, their faces open and smiling. Mr. Wren, Mistress Wren, welcome. Jedediah gestured to the long table at the head of the celebration. Near the platform, we have saved a place for you. Mara's hand tightened on the basket. The last time she had been in that hall, she had been a spectacle, a defendant. Now, she was a guest of honor. Elias put his good hand on the small of her back, a silent, steady pressure. He nodded to Jedediah. We thank you. They sat. People came by, one by one, not to stare, but to speak, to nod, to offer a slice of pie. They were neighbors. After the meal, Pastor Allen stood on the platform. He quieted the crowd. He spoke of the hard winter. He spoke of the fire. He spoke of the goodness of community, of neighbors helping neighbors. And he spoke of the water, this spring, our life, he said, his voice carrying in the warm air. It belongs to all of us, and we are grateful to the man who guards its source. He turned and gestured to Elias. Mr. Wren, our neighbor on the mountain, he has a few words. Elias did not want to stand. He was a man of the axe and the trap line, not of the public speech. He looked at Mara. She was watching him, her gray eyes full of a faith that felt stronger than the mountain. She nodded. Just once. He stood up. He was wearing a clean blue shirt. Micah, sensing the moment, came and stood beside him, clutching his father's hand. Elias looked out at the faces. He saw Thomas, his face clean of soot. He saw Mistress Cray, her back straight and proud. He saw Jedediah and his family. His voice was low, and the town leaned in to hear him. "We came to town months ago." He paused. "We came for salt." A few people smiled. They remembered the story. "We did not know I did not know what we would find." He looked down at Micah, then at Mara. "We found more than we bargained for." He looked back at the crowd. "This is hard country. It is easy to be alone, but you did not let us be alone. When the fire came, you came. You saved our home. You saved our pasture. You saved us." He had no other words. He cleared his throat. He put his good hand on Mara's shoulder, a public act that sealed their bond. "We thank you." Then, after a long pause, he said the words that mattered most. "And we are staying." For a moment, there was silence. Then the applause began. It was not a wild cheer. It was a deep, rolling sound of approval. It was the sound of 100 hands, calloused and strong. It was the sound of acceptance. Elias Wren, the strange mountain man, and Mara Wren, the burlap bride, were no longer outsiders. They belonged. Elias sat down, his face stiff. Mara put her hand on his, under the table. Later, as the sun began to dip, people came to their table. Thomas the blacksmith pushed through the crowd. He was holding something. He was a man of few words, and he looked awkward. He held out a new tin cup. It was simple, shiny, and strong. "Aye, this is for the cabin, for the boy." Elias took it. It was heavy. Thomas had used a steel punch to hammer a single, simple word into the metal. Wren. It was a name, made permanent. Elias nodded, his throat thick. "Thomas, it is a good cup." Thomas, pleased, just grunted and moved away. Then Mistress Cray came, her eyes bright. She bustled past Elias, her focus entirely on Mara. "Child," she said, "I have watched you. You are a fine woman, a strong woman, but you wear your hair like it is a chore." Mara touched the simple knot at the back of her neck. Mistress Cray held up her hand. In it was a length of ribbon. It was not a pale, washed-out color. It was a bright, vivid, shocking blue. It was the exact color of the wild lupine that grew by the spring. "The flower Micah gave you, it was this color." She said, "Your face is not for hiding, Mara, and your hair is not just for pulling back. It is beautiful. Let it be beautiful." Before Mara could protest, the older woman, with quick, practiced hands, untied the leather thong. She loosened Mara's dark hair, then gathered it back, tying it with the bright blue ribbon. Mara's hands lifted to her head. She felt the soft silk. It was the first truly beautiful, impractical thing she had owned in her life. She looked at Mistress Cray, her eyes stinging. "There," the widow said, patting her shoulder. "Now, you look like the lady of the mountain." The walk home was quiet. The sun was setting, painting the high peaks in colors of rose and gold. The air was cool and smelled of pine and of the faint, sweet green of the new ryegrass. Micah, exhausted by the day, slept in Elias's good arm. Mara walked beside them, her basket light. They reached the cabin. Elias put Micah in his bed, the boy never stirring. Elias and Mara went to the porch. They sat on the bench, the one he had built. The valley below them was a pool of darkness, pricked with the small, distant lights of the town, their town. Mara leaned her head on Elias's shoulder. His arm, the one with the long, silver scar from the trap, came around her. It was a familiar, solid weight. They did not speak for a long time. The great dramatic trials were over. The silence that settled between them was not empty. It was full. It was the quiet of a shared life. Elias broke the silence first, his voice a low rumble. "We need to clear that lower ditch again. The last rain washed it full of stone." Mara nodded against his shirt. "I saw, in the garden. I want to plant corn this year, near the beans." "The seed will cost," Elias said. "The eggs will cover it," Mara answered. "The hens are laying well. We will have enough." Mara closed her eyes. This was it. This was the happiness she had never even dared to pray for. It was not a lightning strike. It was not a grand passion from a poem. It was this, the solid weight of his arm, the quiet, practical talk of ditches and seeds. It was the simple, profound knowledge that the man beside her was not a savior. He was a partner. It was not magic. It was the thousand small, honest, repeated actions. It was the cup of hot water he left for her in the morning. It was the way she mended his coat. It was the hand he reached for in the dark. It was the deep, unshakable foundation of respect and shared work and a quiet, steady love. Micah is smart, Mara said into the darkness. He watches everything. He is drawing his letters in the flower when he thinks I do not see. I can teach him the axe, Elias said. The trap line. How to read the weather. He needs more, Mara said softly. I can read, but not well enough. He needs books. He needs to see a map, to know there is a world beyond this mountain. Elias was quiet. He thought of his own limited schooling. There are other children up here, Mara continued. A new idea taking root. The families on the North Ridge. Jedediah's cousins. We could teach them. Elias turned his head, looking at her profile in the starlight. He saw her, not as the woman he had saved, but as a force, a creator. A school, he said, here, in this cabin. A small one, she said, the idea growing. We would need a real book, a proper reader, and a map of the whole world. Elias looked at the bare wall of the cabin, and a shelf, to put them on. He nodded, a slow, decisive movement. I will build a shelf. Next time we go to town, we will order a map. He looked out at the valley. He had always guarded the spring, the water that gave life to the valley. But this, he thought, this idea of Mara's, this was a second spring, one that would give life to his son's mind. They sat in the deep, comfortable quiet. The only sound was the creek. A silver thread of sound, constant and eternal. Mara listened. She remembered the first night she had heard it. It had sounded so lonely, the voice of a vast, empty wilderness. Now, it was a lullaby. It was the sound of her home. She looked at the new fence line. In the faint starlight, she could see a blur of dark color against the earth. The lupines she had planted, they had taken root. They were spreading. The town, she thought, had learned. Silas Dobbins, with his scales and his silver dollars, had tried to weigh a person. He had failed. He was still at his post, but his power was broken. He was just a man who sold flour. The community had learned that justice, even if it is slow and muddled and simple, is strong. It is built not on paper, but on the willingness of neighbors to stand together, to speak the truth, to keep their word. Finally, a chill crept into the air. Elias stirred. Time for sleep. They went inside. The cabin was warm, the embers in the hearth glowing a deep, steady red. Micah was breathing deeply in his bed. Safe. Elias stood by the table, looking at the new tin cup. He traced the letters of his own name. Mara moved to the oil lamp on the shelf. It was the last light. She turned and looked at her husband. He looked at her. His face, scarred by fire and lined by the mountain, was the most beautiful face she had ever seen. He smiled. A small, true smile. Just for her. She lifted her hand, cupped the glass chimney, and blew. The flame vanished. The room fell into a soft darkness, lit only by the red glow of the embers. The firelight was going to sleep. Mara stood in the warm, quiet dark. She was not cold. She was not hungry. She was not afraid. The wind on the mountain was just the wind. The night was just the night. This was the first night of her life that she was completely, entirely, and perfectly safe. Sometimes, the world throws us into a cruel moment so we can learn tenderness and call that place home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and give your support by pressing the hype button so this story and video can be heard by more people.